My entire family, both parents, three siblings, four aunts and uncles, every cousin I grew up with, skipped my wedding to attend my sister's vow renewal on the exact same afternoon. 3 weeks later, my mother called asking if I could co-sign a loan. My name is Petronella, and I want to walk you through exactly how a family chooses between two events happening on the same day, and what happens when the people who made that choice come back needing something from the daughter they didn't show up for. This story does not slow down. Stay with me. Fast context, because the pace only accelerates from here. I'm the middle child of five. My older sister, Wilhelmina, has always been, in ways I spent most of my childhood and adulthood not fully naming out loud, the unambiguous center of our family's attention. Not through any particular effort on her part necessarily, just through some long-established family gravity that had existed for as long as I could remember. One where her milestones were treated as communal events and everyone else's were treated as, at best, secondary. I got engaged to my now husband, Aurelio, about 14 months before this story starts. We set our wedding date roughly a year out, choosing a Saturday in early October specifically because it worked for both our family schedules, checking, deliberately and repeatedly, with my parents and siblings months in advance to make sure there were no conflicts. Wilhelmina announced her vow renewal, celebrating 10 years of marriage, about 5 months into my own wedding planning process, choosing, without any apparent awareness of the conflict, the exact same Saturday I'd already had locked in for months, publicly announced, with save the dates already mailed. I want to describe what happened when I raised this conflict with my family, because it set the entire tone for everything that followed. I called my mother first, gently pointing out the overlap, assuming it was simply an oversight that could be easily resolved. Wilhelmina moving her event by a week, or my parents simply attending mine given that mine had been scheduled first and publicly announced for months already. "Oh," my mother said, in a tone I remember specifically because it carried none of the concern I expected. "Well, Wilhelmina's already booked the venue for that date. I'm sure you two can figure something out." I want to be honest that "figure something out" turned out to mean, over the following months of increasingly difficult conversations, that my family expected me to be the one who adjusted, move my own wedding date. They suggested more than once, as though a year of vendor deposits and guest coordination could simply be rescheduled with a shrug. When I declined, explaining, repeatedly, that my wedding had been on the calendar first, publicly announced first, and that moving it at that late stage would cost us thousands of dollars in non-refundable deposits, the conversation shifted, gradually, into something that felt less like a scheduling conflict and more like a referendum on which event actually mattered more to my family. I want to tell you about the weeks leading up to that Saturday, because the writing, in hindsight, was clearly on the wall in ways I hadn't let myself fully absorb at the time. My mother mentioned, almost in passing, about 6 weeks before the date, that she and my father had decided to attend Wilhelmina's renewal. "Since it's a milestone anniversary, and yours is more of a first-time thing, there'll be other chances to celebrate with everyone." My younger brother followed shortly after, then my other sister, then, one by one over the following weeks, every single member of my extended family who had originally RSVP'd to my wedding quietly, individually, informed me they'd be attending Wilhelmina's event instead. I want to describe the actual day itself, because I think it matters to understanding the full weight of what happened. My wedding, when it finally arrived, was beautiful in every way that mattered. Aurelio's family showed up in full, my closest friends were there, the ceremony itself was everything I'd hoped for. But I stood at that altar, looking out at a room where every single seat reserved for my own blood relatives sat completely empty, an entire section of chairs with small printed name cards for people who had, every one of them, chosen a 10-year anniversary party over my actual wedding day. I found out, through photos posted to social media that same evening, what my family's afternoon had actually looked like: a lavish outdoor ceremony, my mother in a dress clearly bought specifically for the occasion, toasts, an entire day of visible, enthusiastic celebration for an event that was, by any reasonable measure, considerably less significant than a first wedding. Happening at the exact same hour my own vows were being exchanged to an audience missing every single person who shared my last name. I want to tell you what I did in the immediate aftermath, because I think it matters to how the rest of this story unfolds. I didn't explode, didn't send an angry group text, didn't do anything dramatic in the moment. I simply, quietly, pulled back, declined the next several family gatherings, kept communication with my parents and siblings minimal and largely logistics-based, and spent the following weeks processing, mostly with Aurelio and my closest friends, the specific, layered grief of realizing exactly where I apparently ranked in my own family's priorities. 3 weeks after my wedding, my mother called. I want to describe the tone of that call carefully, because it was, in almost every respect, completely ordinary. Cheerful, casual, no acknowledgement whatsoever of the preceding weeks of near silence between us, as though the entire wedding conflict had simply never happened at all. "Hi, sweetheart," she said. "I wanted to ask you something. Your father and I are looking at refinancing the house, and the bank mentioned we'd get a much better rate if we had a co-signer with strong credit. Would you be willing to help us out with that?" I sat with that question for a long moment, genuinely needing to process the sheer audacity of it before I could formulate any kind of response. 3 weeks. 3 weeks after standing at my own altar looking at an empty section of chairs reserved for the exact people now asking me for a significant financial favor, one that would tie my own credit and financial standing to a decision I would have no ongoing control over. "You want me to co-sign a loan," I said. "3 weeks after you skipped my wedding." There was a pause on her end, the specific pause of someone genuinely not having connected those two things until I said them out loud together. "This isn't really related to that," she said. "This is just a practical financial thing. We thought, since you're doing well, it might be an easy way to help the family." I want to describe what happened over the following conversation, because it revealed, more clearly than almost anything else in this entire story, exactly how my family had processed, or failed to process, what they'd actually done 3 weeks earlier. When I raised the wedding directly, explaining that I genuinely could not separate the two things, that being asked for a significant financial favor so soon after being so completely deprioritized felt, to me, like a continuation of the same pattern rather than an unrelated request, my mother's response was, "I want to be honest," one of the most clarifying moments of the entire ordeal. "I don't understand why you're still upset about this," she said. "Wilhelmina's anniversary only happens once. We knew you'd understand, since you're the reasonable one in the family. You're the reasonable one." I want to sit with that phrase for a moment, because I think it's the specific detail that, once I fully absorbed it, reframed my entire understanding of my role in my own family, not just around this one incident, but across my whole life. I had been, apparently, for as long as anyone could remember, the sibling who was expected to absorb disappointment gracefully, to deprioritize her own milestones without complaint, precisely because everyone had learned, over years, that I generally would. I declined the loan request. I want to be honest that this was, in some ways, one of the more difficult boundaries I've ever set with my family, because it required me to sit directly with my mother's clear disappointment and confusion, holding firm against a lifetime of learned instinct to simply absorb that disappointment the way I apparently always had. "I can't," I said. "And I think, honestly, the fact that you're asking me this at all, 3 weeks after skipping my wedding, tells me something I needed to understand more clearly than I did before. I want to tell you about the weeks that followed, because they escalated in ways I genuinely did not expect. My mother, apparently frustrated by my refusal, brought the situation to the rest of the family, framing it, according to what I heard secondhand from my younger brother, who reached out privately, uncomfortable with how the whole thing was being characterized, as me holding a grudge and punishing the family over what she described to others as just a scheduling thing that got blown out of proportion. I want to describe the conversation I eventually had with Wilhelmina directly, because it was, in some ways, the most important one of this entire story. I asked her, plainly, whether she'd ever actually considered moving her own event once she learned it conflicted with a wedding that had been scheduled and announced first. Her answer, delivered with what I could tell was genuine, if belated, discomfort, was one I've turned over many times since. "I didn't think it would matter that much," she said. "I figured you'd understand, because you always do. I think I just assumed you'd be fine with it, the way you're always fine with things. The way you're always fine with things." Another version of the same underlying assumption, from a different family member, and I want to be honest that hearing it stated so plainly, twice, within the same difficult stretch of weeks, was, in its own way, almost more clarifying than the original wedding day absence itself. My entire family, it seemed, had built an unspoken but consistent understanding of me as the sibling whose feelings and milestones could be safely deprioritized, precisely because I had, for years, made it easy for them to believe that. I want to tell you what I did next, because I think it's the part of this story that matters most, even though it's less dramatic than the initial confrontation. I didn't cut my family off entirely. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's sometimes an expectation, in stories like this, that the only meaningful response to this kind of pattern is complete estrangement, and that's not the choice I ultimately made. What I did instead was significantly, deliberately restructure the terms of my relationship with almost everyone involved. Clearer boundaries around what I would and wouldn't accommodate, considerably reduced willingness to absorb disappointment silently, and a new, explicit expectation stated directly to my parents and siblings. That reciprocity in this family was going to need to become a two-way street going forward rather than the one-directional pattern it had apparently been for most of my adult life. I want to be honest that this shift did not go smoothly or immediately. There were several more difficult conversations over the following months, moments where old patterns tried to reassert themselves, family gatherings where I could feel the specific, uncomfortable tension of people recalibrating around a version of me that no longer automatically absorbed things the way I always had before. But I want to tell you about the moment, about 8 months later, that made me feel like something had genuinely shifted. My father called, ahead of my own upcoming birthday, specifically to ask what I might want to do to celebrate. A small, almost unremarkable gesture that would have meant nothing in most families, but that felt, given everything that had happened, like a genuinely meaningful acknowledgement that my milestones were, finally, being treated with the same consideration everyone else's always had been. I started therapy about 2 months after the wedding itself, once the initial shock had settled enough into something closer to a sustained, specific ache that I recognized needed more structured processing than I could do entirely on my own. My therapist has helped me understand that what happened wasn't really, at its core, about a single scheduling conflict, however painful that conflict was in the moment. It was about a long-established, largely unspoken family pattern finally becoming impossible to ignore or rationalize away, one that required not just processing the wedding day itself, but genuinely reevaluating years of smaller, similar moments I'd previously absorbed without fully naming them for what they were. I think, more than anything, about standing at that altar, looking out at an entire section of empty chairs with printed name cards for people who shared my blood and had chosen, every single one of them, somewhere else to be. I think about how completely, silently I might have continued absorbing that exact pattern indefinitely, had my mother's phone call 3 weeks later not arrived with such stark, almost absurd timing, a request that, however unintentionally, laid the entire underlying dynamic out so plainly that I genuinely could not continue pretending not to see it. It's been just over 2 years now. My mother said something to me about a year after everything happened that I still think about often, sitting at her own kitchen table, a conversation that felt, finally, like genuine reckoning rather than defensive minimizing. She said, "I don't think we ever really thought about what it cost you, being the one we could always count on to understand. I think we just got used to it being easy, and easy isn't the same thing as fair, and I'm sorry it took you finally saying no to something for us to actually see that." I didn't fully believe her sincerity at the time. I want to be honest that trust, once specifically eroded this way, doesn't rebuild instantly just because someone finally says the right words. I believe it more now, 2 years out, watching the actual, sustained pattern of behavior that has followed that conversation, rather than just the words themselves. If you've ever discovered, through some specific, undeniable moment, that your family had quietly built an entire dynamic around your willingness to be endlessly understanding, and had to decide, for the first time, what happens when you finally stop being quite so understanding, I want to hear about it. I think there's something important about naming these long, slow-building patterns clearly, because they rarely announce themselves as dramatically as a single missed wedding does. And sometimes it takes exactly that kind of stark, unmistakable moment to finally see a pattern you'd been living inside for years without fully naming it. One empty section of chairs. One phone call 3 weeks later. That's all it took to finally understand exactly where I'd been ranked in my own family, and exactly how long I'd been quietly, willingly accepting it.